Seen regularly, and it got to the point where I realised that I needed to learn to read music, and so that's what I did. So I understand that part.
For decades, the world saw Jimmy Page as the mysterious wizard of Led Zeppelin, the man behind some of the most iconic riffs in rock history. But today, Bob Seger has finally shattered the silence and opened up about the darker side of Page, the rivalries, the feuds, and the scandals that many fans never dared to confront. What Seger revealed was not the story of a genius alone, but of a man whose brilliance was constantly overshadowed by turmoil and bitterness. In the late 1960s, when London's clubs were pulsing with energy and psychedelic colors, Jimmy Page rose to the top like a storm. On stage, he looked untouchable, his guitar conjuring walls of sound that left audiences stunned, yet backstage a darker current flowed. He was the mastermind who turned Led Zeppelin into a roaring beast of sound, but the same qualities that built the legend also seeded unease. Behind the glittering success, there were already whispers. Musicians who worked with him described a man who was brilliant, but manipulative, charismatic, yet suffocatingly controlling. Even among his peers, Page carried an aura that dazzled and unsettled at once, a figure both magnetic and menacing, admired from a distance but rarely trusted up close. Inside Led Zeppelin, the tensions were impossible to hide. Robert Plant often found himself clashing with Page over creative decisions, especially when Page's obsession with darker, mystical imagery overshadowed the music itself. Plant's soaring voice longed for light and freedom, yet Page dragged the sound into shadows, creating a constant tug-of-war. John Paul Jones, quiet and reserved, grew frustrated with Page's dominance and erratic behavior, torn between respect for his genius and anger at his suffocating control. And John Bonham, the fiery drummer, sometimes lashed out in anger when Page's choices threatened to push the band into chaos. On a moment the two would lock together like thunder and lightning, the yapai. Next they would explode in arguments that shook the walls. The group that appeared invincible on stage was, in truth, a battlefield of egos and bitterness, brilliance set against destruction, harmony poisoned by rivalry. Think of the wild stories you've heard about rock excess in the 1970s. Many of them orbit around Jimmy Page. The drugs and the drinking pushed him into reckless spirals, while the notorious parties in Los Angeles' Chateau Marmont and the Continental Hyatt House became theaters of chaos where glamour clashed with ruin. He earned a reputation that was less about music and more about madness, a legend wrapped in smoke and shadow. Stories of Page's involvement with the occult only deepened the mystique, casting him in the eyes of some as a sorcerer of sound and in the eyes of others as a man lost in dangerous illusions. For many friends and collaborators, it was not mystery but menace, a distraction that corroded trust and pushed people away. While others sought fleeting joy in the chaos, Page often seemed to feed darker demons, a figure both magnetic and terrifying, whose brilliance stood in constant contrast with the abyss he stared into. Page's conflicts didn't end with his bandmates. Rival guitarists, from Jeff Beck to Eric Clapton, bristled at his arrogance, yet they also begrudgingly admired the ferocity of his playing. Behind the scenes, record producers and tour managers spoke of endless disputes, Page demanding absolute control, clashing with anyone who dared challenge him, while others admitted his obsession sometimes pushed performances into greatness.
There's been a smokescreen of nonsense and this sort of idiotic stuff of Jimmy Page is sleeping in his garden and all this sort of nonsense, which I did get an apology out of it.
His rivalry with the Rolling Stones camp was legendary. Both sides accused the other of stealing ideas, fueling a Cold War between rock's biggest names that mixed inspiration with resentment. For every triumph Page achieved, there seemed to be an equally sharp quarrel, shadowing it, a contrast between admiration and animosity that followed him wherever he went. Personal relationships around Page often ended in fractures, leaving a trail of hurt and disillusionment. Musicians who admired him from afar found working with him a nightmare once they entered his inner circle. His insistence on secrecy, manipulation, and total control created a climate of distrust that poisoned even the strongest bonds. Old friends from the Yardbirds era, like Chris Dreja and Jim McCarty, grew distant as Page's meteoric rise with Zeppelin left them feeling discarded and betrayed. Collaborators who once believed in his vision later spoke of broken promises, unpaid debts, and projects that collapsed under the weight of his erratic behavior. Even allies who once defended him eventually stepped away, weary of the never-ending cycle of indulgence, paranoia, and dominance. For many, friendship with Page meant walking a tightrope over chaos, an experience that ended not with loyalty, but with silence and distance. Page's greatest strength was also his greatest flaw: control. He demanded it over the music and the image and even the myth of Led Zeppelin. In rehearsals, he dictated every note. In the Och studio, he pushed engineers through marathon sessions that lasted until dawn. And on tour, he micromanaged even the smallest details of stage presentation. But the harder he tried to control everything, the more he lost control of himself. Studio engineers recalled endless nights ruined by his perfectionism, with Page demanding take after take until tempers broke. Tour staff spoke of exhaustion and fury as they catered to his every whim, carrying the weight of his obsession while collapsing under it themselves. And his bandmates? They learned to resent the man who could not let go of the reins, watching as the band's unity dissolved into Page's unrelenting grip, where creativity too often drowned in the shadow of domination. Outside the glare of the spotlight, Page faced battles that shook him deeply. Addiction gnawed at him, pulling him into a spiral of dependency that scarred not only his health and reputation, but also his very spirit. Heroin and alcohol became constant companions, dragging him into dark corners where the energy of Led Zeppelin seemed a distant memory. He drifted between periods of brilliance and collapse, sometimes dazzling on stage and other times vanishing into long absences that worried fans and angered colleagues. His weight fluctuated, his hands shook, and those close to him often described a man lost between genius and self-destruction. The once untouchable guitarist found himself in hospitals, in fragile recoveries, and in rumors of overdoses. Friends whispered of interventions that failed, of nights spent in near silence as Page stared into the void. He became both the architect of immortal music and a prisoner of his own demons, a man who once commanded arenas but now struggled to command even himself. Bob Seger is not the only rocker who spoke of Page with disdain. Across the rock world, the list of names who bristled at him is long. Pete Townshend of The Who, long irritated by Zeppelin's overwhelming success, was openly hostile toward Page's approach, dismissing his style as overblown and his presence as suffocating. Jeff Beck, once a companion from the Yardbirds days, carried grudges after years of competition and unspoken rivalry. Eric Clapton, who felt overshadowed by Page's rapid ascent, quietly distanced himself and never forgave the arrogance he perceived in him. Others in the rock community whispered that Page's shadowy persona was not an act, but an extension of who he truly was. A man, consumed by his own power, feared rather than loved by many of his peers. Behind the curtains, producers, critics, and even journalists admitted that approaching him was like walking into a storm, unpredictable, electric, and dangerous. His aura repelled as much as it attracted, leaving him locked in feuds that never healed and rivalries that defined entire eras of rock history. Today, when people remember Jimmy Page, they often think of the blazing guitar solos, the dragon suits, and the mystical aura. But with Seger's revelations, another picture emerges, that of a man who achieved greatness but alienated countless people along the way. His life became a battlefield of triumphs and betrayals, brilliance and darkness, obsession and collapse. What remains is not only a catalog of immortal songs, but a long trail of broken ties, bitter rivals, and shattered friendships. For every achievement that lifted him into the pantheon of rock, there was an equally devastating wound left on those around him. The stories of legendary riffs stand alongside stories of bitterness, anger, and estrangement, weaving a legacy as contradictory as it is unforgettable. In the E. And his story is not just about music, it is about the dangerous weight of control, the poison of ego, and the endless hunger for power that scarred not only himself, but everyone who dared to stand close. It is the story of a genius who reached unimaginable heights while dragging shadows behind him, a legacy that glitters and haunts at the same time, forever split between admiration and unease, celebrated in public yet mourned in private by those who bore the cost of his ambition.